It's Sunday afternoon in Colorado Springs. Church crowds are trickling home. Football fans are gearing up for a Broncos game. And on the east side of town, Officer Charles Ackerman is enjoying a peaceful day on patrol. Suddenly, Ackerman's radio crackles with a call to service.
29213 18th Avenue South.
Dispatch is requesting a police presence at a home on South Hancock Avenue.
Family members had called in, hadn't heard from the parties, and they wanted their welfare checked. Make sure everybody was okay and have them contact the family. I knocked on the front door.
Police department!
There was no response. I proceeded my way around the building itself, see if I could find any open doors.
But while walking past a side window, Ackerman makes a startling discovery.
That's when I observed a body laying inside the residence. Initially, I thought somebody may have been sleeping on the floor.
You okay?
Banged harder on the windows and the body wasn't moving at all. Then you start thinking the worst.
Ackerman pries open the window and rushes to the woman's aid. Her vitals confirm his fear.
I found the body to be actually cold to the touch, no pulse.
Ackerman can find no sign of physical trauma on the woman's body, but the state of her clothing raises suspicions of foul play.
I noted that the pants were undone, her blouse was lifted up, like possible sexual assault.
The body at Officer Ackerman's feet is just the beginning. Sweeping the premises, he quickly finds himself stepping through the scene of a brutal massacre. One that would haunt Ackerman and his fellow officers for decades to come.
Step everybody up. Notified my supervisor, advised him that we need to have major crimes come out and take a look at this.
Lt.Joe Kenda is heading back to the station when an urgent call comes in.
Who it was a frantic police dispatcher spitting out information about a multiple death going on at 503 South Hancock, followed by, get here right now, on my way.
Minutes later, Kenda pulls up at the scene. The house is swarming with both law enforcement and local media, all of them looking for clues that might explain the carnage inside.
Hey, Lt.
How you doing? What do we got?
Crime scenes are always chaotic. Lots of things happening. This was beyond the pale. This is more out of control than I've ever seen one. There are lots of cops, including the entire command staff of the police department, to include the chief of police.
That's a big deal, particularly on a Sunday afternoon. There's something really wrong here.
There's a reason there are so many detectives at the crime scene. Officers have discovered not one body, but 5.
They said there's 5 bodies in there, young kids and a woman. They're all dead. And I'm thinking, oh, God. Not that.
I don't care how callous you are or experienced. When you see dead children, it's pretty bad.
But according to Kenda's men, there's much more to the story.
Also, there's some kind of altar above the fireplace. Some kind of cult thing.
The word is it was a ritualistic homicide that had religious overtones and probably involved sexual assault. What?
Well, he found a dead cat on a homemade altar, and it appeared that maybe the cat might have been sacrificed.
Responding officers have theorized the murders were the work of a devilish cult.
I take the quiet possession of a man self.
One that raped the woman, killed her and her children, then sacrificed their cat as part of some dark ritual.
whatever evil beast or danger lies.
To Kenda, it's a theory that sounds as bizarre as it does gruesome. But experience tells him not to discount it just yet.
As initial reports go, this was certainly pretty much over the top. But my experience tells me don't preconceive anything. They're talking about clothing disturbed. They're talking about a makeshift altar in the house with religious artifacts. I said, okay, that's the story? Yes, but there's only one way to find out. I'm gonna go in there and look.
Stepping through the doorway, Kenda takes note of an odor he's come to know all too well.
It's the smell of death. You never forget that smell. That odor is unique and it's overwhelming.
Kenda starts his investigation by examining the dead woman.
Her pants are unzipped and the flaps are laid open. If clothing is disturbed, there's always a possibility of sexual assault.
At first glance, the woman's cause of death is unclear.
There are no wounds, there are no stab wounds, no gunshot, no anything.
Hoping to learn more about the possible cause of death,
Want to take me to the others?
Yes.
Kenda examines the children's bodies.
The children are ages 9, 11, 13, and 15. Their fingernails are turning black. These people have been dead for 3 or 4 days.
The cause of death is still unclear, and Kenda needs to find out if all 5 victims were the intended targets. And if so, why would anyone want to harm them?
Multiple victims, a dead animal, a homemade altar. This is certainly new. It's certainly no accident. But I don't know much else.
As Kenda soon finds out, there's more to this crime scene than meets the eye. But he won't rest until he uncovers the truth, even if it kills him.
I was driven to be in homicide. If you're gonna do it well,
She seems scared.
it consumes you. You're standing and holding that line.
In the afternoon hours of January 14th, Lt.Joe Kenda is standing at the scene of a massacre. A household of 5 has been found dead on South Hancock Avenue. The cause of death is unknown. Making matters worse, initial reports of occult killing have brought droves of onlookers, as well as the local media, all crowding the tape line to get a look at the crime scene.
They were saying that they suspected a ritualistic murder, that they suspected sexual abuse.
But to Kenda, there's still one detail that doesn't gel with the notion of a ritual killing: the relatively pristine condition of the dead cat.
Animals tend not to be relaxed when they're being sacrificed. Was its head cut off? Is there a knife pinning it to the altar? No. There is no violence associated with this body of this animal. Why?
Suddenly, Kenda is struck by a strange sensation, the feeling that he's going to be sick.
It overcame me. Disorientation of the thought process, abdominal cramps that get more and more severe. I felt terrible.
Kenda has an epiphany, one that quickly snaps his symptoms into focus and casts the whole crime scene in an alarming new light.
I know what killed these people, and it's still present in this building.
We gotta get out of here.
What?
Now, we gotta get out of here.
So let's get out of here. Right now. Get out.
Get everybody back! Get everybody back! Everybody back! Seal up the house! Nobody goes in! Hey, Lt, you alright?
Kenda knows what the cause of death is, but he needs proof.
I called the utilities company to send a guy out with a device, a test device, that is designed to take an air sample.
Now you don't have
Within minutes, utilities rep Lt.Joe is on the scene, equipment in hand.
He goes, I hate to do this to you, but you're the only one that can go in and see what's going on.
Wow, I'm already getting a hit.
The alarm goes off on his box. So he sticks his arm into the house.
The alarm went off immediately. I said, we have to leave now. We can't stay here.
This is absolutely fatal level of carbon monoxide. Absolutely fatal. So that's very interesting. Very interesting indeed. I call the fire department. I get a rig down there, turn off the gas at the meter, get your fans out of your truck and vent this building. They plug in fans normally used to disperse smoke from a fire scene.
Kenda gathers his team of detectives and tells them to forget everything they've heard about occult killing. He has a far simpler explanation for the scene inside: carbon monoxide poisoning.
There is no sexual assault. There aren't any ritualistic overtones. There aren't any sacrifices of animals. What there is carbon monoxide. That's what's in this house. It is odorless, colorless, tasteless, and deadly.
And that's why they call it a silent killer, because it just comes up and gets you.
But in order to confirm his new theory, Kenda needs to take one more look at the victims' bodies. He starts with the young woman, the one that at first glance appeared to have been sexually assaulted.
Knowing one of the symptoms is severe abdominal cramps. A disoriented person would probably loosen their clothing at the waist because they're in pain. So the fact that she unzipped her pants is very explainable.
Kenda also notices the woman's splotchy, unnatural skin color. Another sign of carbon monoxide poisoning.
Carbon monoxide poisoning produces a particular effect in human bodies. It's referred to as cherry pink and apple blossom white. It is unique to that manner of death. Looking at the remaining 4 bodies and the same pink and white skin, it's obvious to me what has killed them.
Even the alleged animal sacrifice is starting to make sense. The cat wasn't ritualistically slaughtered. It simply crawled up and died. It appears that their alleged massacre is probably nothing more than a tragic accident, one likely caused by a faulty gas appliance. But Kenda has been at enough crime scenes to know that things are never what they seem.
I am unwilling to write off the death of 5 people until I know everything. There were 4 gas appliances in this house. So now the next step is to determine which one is the source.
Once the home is aired out, Kenda tasks utility worker Lt.Joe with finding out. Detectives tell Kenda there's someone on the scene who he should have a word with.
Lieutenant, this guy says he owns the property.
An elderly man by the name of Daryl Atkinson.
He's a retired member of the fire department, a 72-year-old man who is very distressed and almost in tears over the death of these people. So we talked to him. He says, I've owned this house and rented it for 20-some years. There are no issues with the furnaces or with the stove. Never had a problem. Can't imagine this happening.
No problem.
Lt.Joe emerges from the house and announces he knows the source of the leak.
I found the problem. The CO is coming from one of the heaters. I really think you should come take a look at it.
Jago has seen heaters turn deadly before, but never like this.
The amount of carbon monoxide that was escaping this device was considered to be unreasonably high.
It was pouring out 2,300 parts per million. It could kill you instantly.
Here's the problem. That's the heat exchange. It's put in backwards.
Jago explains that the heat exchanger is designed to channel exhaust fumes from the home. If installed backwards, it does the reverse.
The result is that this is going to produce nothing but carbon monoxide in huge amounts.
So when the burners had come on, it was spilling noxious fumes right into the house.
Atkinson is stunned.
You said that nobody's worked on this thing?
No, have not had it worked on.
He tells Kenda that the furnace rarely breaks down, and when it does, he always hired a licensed professional.
You wouldn't think a furnace person, a heater, ventilation, and air conditioning person would install it in backwards.
But the more Jago explains about the costly mistake, the more Kenda begins to wonder if the backwards heat exchanger was a mistake at all.
He says it's designed to only go in one way to prevent you from putting it in backwards. But someone hammered this in here. And he says to me, whoever did this had absolutely no idea what they were doing. And I looked at him and I said, yeah, or they did know.
That would certainly be a way to take care of somebody.
Kenda is now convinced that someone wanted everyone in that house dead. This is murder, and the stakes have changed.
Is it a killer who is hopeful that we won't find this, or we won't even look for it, and we'll write this off as an accident? That's what it looks like to me. Now I've got a mission. This is not an accident. Pure and simple. My focus now is on two things. First thing is victimology, and the second thing is who might be a suspect in something like this.
Kenda needs to find out who would want to see the family of 5 dead. Fortunately, detectives have found 2 women who might have some answers. Frances Chacon and Nellie Moreno.
My best 2 sources are standing right outside in the crowd, very distressed, so it's important we talk to them.
Frances and Nellie explain that the 3 youngest victims are their nephews, Mario, Danny, and Nash. The female victim is Frances and Nellie's sister, 34-year-old Sophie Gerardo.
She just had the heart of gold. Everybody loved her. That's just the way she was. And she loved her kids.
Sophie is a hard worker. She works to keep her family together. Always in low-end jobs, but always works. She's working poor.
Guys, just set those in your room.
Kenda learns the single mother had just saved enough money to move into the house on Hancock Avenue.
Once we get settled, we gotta go back out.
Frances tells Kenda that the 5th victim is her own son, Mark.
He had a great personality. Everybody loved him. He was real good at, taking care of me, like a little man.
He was just wonderful. He was helping her moving. He loved Sophie. He was always hanging out with Sophie. You want me to do this, Auntie? Do you want me to do this, Auntie? He would have been a really good man.
The sister's description of a humble, loving family makes their murders all the more unthinkable. Kenda has no choice but to inform them that foul play may be involved.
You think of anyone that had something against her, that she was fighting with, someone who would want to see her hurt?
But Nellie's reaction stops Kenda in his tracks.
Nellie Moreno was absolutely convinced her sister had been murdered. Nellie says she has 2 boyfriends. The 2 guys know about each other, and they don't like each other. Ooh. Not only we have suspects, we have 2 of them.
On January 14th, 1990, Lt.Joe Kenda found single mother Sophie Gerardo poisoned to death along with her 3 sons and nephew. The culprit is carbon monoxide spilling from Sophie's living room furnace. But after learning that someone converted the furnace into a killing machine, Kenda's search for the true killer is just getting started.
Is this an accident? Is it on purpose? I know the method. I don't know the manner. So now I have a question to resolve. Who could be involved in this?
Kenda puts that question to the women who knew Sophie best, her sisters, Frances and Nellie. But before Kenda even mentions the word murder, Nellie offers up a pair of prime suspects.
Nellie Moreno was absolutely convinced her sister had been murdered.
According to Nellie, Sophie was juggling 2 boyfriends, and the situation was a constant source of drama.
We have actually a triangle. That's something you have to look at. Was there jealousy? Was there any, domestic problems between the deceased and one of the boyfriends?
There's always some problem going on between her and these 2 guys. They're, in her opinion, rats. Both of them are.
They kind of were just like losers, you know? They were like moochers, I would say.
Nellie also tells Kenda that Sophie had a turbulent relationship with both of her boyfriends.
What the hell are you doing having this man coming in and out of my house when I'm gone?
Look, you need to go.
Shut up! I said shut up!
Nellie says, I am convinced that one of them killed Sophie, and they had to kill the kids because the kids know. Ooh. Not only we have suspects, we have two of them. And if anything that Nellie is saying is even close to true, we have two good ones.
You know these guys' names?
Nellie provides Kenda with the names of both men, Nathan Joyce and Kevin Cusick.
So what do I know about Kevin and Nathan? They don't like each other. They don't like her half the time. And consequently, I like them.
Later that day, Kenda sits down to speak with Sophie's boyfriend, Nathan Joyce.
This is crazy. Why am I here?
He's angry, he's nervous, he's all the right stuff. He argues, he fights. I like that too.
But when Kenda starts asking about Sophie's murder, Nathan softens up fast.
Do you have any information about her death at all? Anything you can think of?
He started crying in the conversation. He also admits that, I love Sophie. I feel so bad that she's dead. Nathan was genuinely distraught.
Why don't you tell me about your relationship? Were you upset when you found out she was dating this other guy, Kevin?
Honestly, I'm the other guy.
What are you doing here?
I came to see you. I've been missing you.
Yeah, but you know Kevin could be around.
When are you gonna leave that guy anyways?
He knew he was stepping in on somebody else's woman, but he was so attracted to her, he didn't care about that.
But Sophie's original boyfriend, Kevin Cusick, certainly did.
Why don't you tell me about Kevin?
I ain't held me down at all. You gonna have somebody come in and out of my house? Are you out of your mind? I said shut up.
Kevin struck her. There would be physical confrontation between the two of them. Sophie would get so angry with Kevin, she told Nathan about it.
Were you ever abusive toward him? Any kind of altercations? Any physicality whatsoever?
I'm in love with her, man.
Shove, slap, anything?
No.
Any arguments, fights?
No, never.
Nathan claims he never laid a finger on Sophie or the kids. By now, Kenda can't help but believe him.
He just doesn't impress me as a guy who would kill. He impressed me as a lovesick dope who just wanted to be around Sophie and didn't really think about much else. So I tell him, okay, for now, go home. We may talk again, but for right now, I'll let you go.
After concluding his interview with Nathan Joyce, Kenda sets out on a hunt for his other suspect, Sophie's jilted boyfriend, Kevin Cusick.
Emotion drives murder. Money, sex, or revenge. There's no money here, but there's sex, and maybe there's revenge. Nathan is no longer a suspect, but I certainly know who is.
Less than 24 hours have passed since Sophie Gerardo and 4 children were found dead in their home. The 5 victims have been killed by the deadly odorless gas, carbon monoxide. Lt.Joe Kenda is convinced that someone deliberately rigged their furnace to murder the innocent family.
Who could kill 5 people? Why would they kill all the kids, you know? That don't make sense.
With that, Kenda shifts focus to his sole remaining suspect, Kevin Cusick. Kevin is clearly jealous enough to assault Sophie Gerardo, and Kenda and his detectives know that kind of rage can easily turn deadly.
That's a definite motive. If this person has a history of violence, he would be a good suspect, especially a violence towards the victim.
Maybe he's mad about her dating Nathan. Or maybe he's just mad. So let's find out about Kevin.
A background check reveals Kevin Cusick works for a local construction company. Kenda decides to pay him a visit.
Kevin, can I talk to you for a minute?
If Kevin does this kind of work, where does that put him? It puts him in contact with tradespeople. heating guys, plumbers, electricians. Could he learn about how to make a furnace not work? Yeah, he could. And no one would think anything of it.
Got some bad news for you.
What's up?
The girl Sophie you've been dating,
Yeah.
she and her 3 kids have all passed away. I'm sorry.
Oh my God.
Like his romantic rival Nathan Joyce, Kevin Cusick seems genuinely distraught.
He's very distressed. He's crying over the deaths. He denies having anything to do with it. Absolutely denies it.
That doesn't stop Kenda from cutting straight to the chase.
I did receive information that you've been physical with her in the past. Put your hands on her?
Surprisingly, Kevin admits to the physical abuse.
I have. I ain't gonna lie, man. I have.
He says he's slapped her before. He says they fight all the time. It's always about Nathan. So he's the personality that wants to get even. The vengeful lover. That somehow she's slighted him. All of which he admits to.
Possible you might be upset that she was dating another guy, Allison?
I was mad at it, yes.
But Kevin maintains he would never kill Sophie, let alone her whole family. Kenda asks Kevin about his whereabouts the days leading up to Sophie's murder.
Can you tell me where you were the past few days?
I don't know. I don't know exactly where I was right this minute.
He has the best alibi in the sense that he doesn't have an alibi. He has no idea where he's been for 3 or 4 days. He comes across very honest about that.
In Kenda's experience, suspects this forthcoming are usually innocent of any crime.
He's actually pretty honest. Because all the reasons why I suspect him, he admits very clearly. No attempt at hiding it, not even an attempt at lying about it. He's very straightforward. He does have a motive, and he has opportunity, but is he the guy? I don't feel it. I just don't feel it about him. So I let him go. Go away. I'll be back in touch with you if I need to be.
Supposing Kenda's gut instincts are correct, it raises a difficult question. If abusive boyfriend Kevin Cusick didn't poison Sophie Gerardo and her family, then who did?
Someone's been recently inside this device. Someone who had possibly a motive to do harm to Sophie and her children. Who is he?
With Sophie's boyfriends cleared, the investigation is back to square one. In hopes of finding a new lead, Kenda talks to her landlord, Daryl Atkinson.
Well, I had some tenants before Sophie was in there that were really troublesome.
They were the last tenants to live here before I rented this place to Sophie. Oh, and who were they? Well, a young man and his young wife. Their name was Marvin and Brenda Hogsett. I just thought they were bad tenants.
They were dirty. They weren't taking care of the apartment. They had pets when they weren't supposed to. And they were behind on their rent.
Atkinson tells Kenda he ultimately had to force the Hogsetts out. Kenda wonders if their dispute may have been cause for revenge.
Marvin, it's Daryl at the door.
Daryl? What do you need, Daryl? I've warned you over and over again. Warned me? Eviction notice. Eviction? You've got 30 days.
Atkinson says, maybe that guy Marvin tampered with that furnace. Well, why would you say that? Well, I remember he told me he was a heating guy.
It's a bombshell revelation, one that instantly rockets Marvin Hogsett to the top of Kenda's suspect list.
Could he make a furnace work? Could he make a furnace not work? Yeah, he could. He's been in this place. He knows how it works and how it's heated. That puts Marvin clearly into the area of maybe tampering with that device.
It also makes Kenda wonder, were Sophie and the kids innocent victims in a sinister plot to poison landlord Daryl Atkinson?
Is it fate? Bad luck? I don't know. But the guy I like the best in this is Marvin Hogsett. I want to talk to him. So we did a little background on him. We find out that he and Brenda are no longer together. Marvin lives in Denver. Brenda still lives in Colorado Springs. So for a matter of convenience, we talked to Brenda first.
Kenda meets Brenda Hogsett at her new home and immediately starts asking her about Marvin.
Brenda?
Yes.
How you doing? Lt.Joe Kenda from the Colorado Springs Police Department.
Okay.
She confirms that as an experienced HVAC repairman, Marvin certainly had the training and experience to turn their landlord's furnace into a death trap.
I think it was called residential heating. He worked for them for a little while.
Kenda presses Brenda for more information about the feud with Marvin. That's when Brenda reveals a shocking detail.
I woke up with a headache. The only thing I remember is I was probably the sickest I have ever been.
She says I was throwing up. My husband felt terrible.
Brenda?
My dad came by,
In here, Dad.
looked at us,
Call an ambulance right now.
said, "You're going to hospital."
Moments later, EMTs were on the scene to whisk Brenda and Marvin to the hospital.
Can you talk to me?
What's going on?
Brenda claims that the next thing she remembers is waking up in the ER.
They told me that I had gotten sick from carbon monoxide.
Marvin borrowed a carbon monoxide detector from work and ran a test on the house. The results were alarming.
It was all over the heater itself, and he told me there was a lot in there.
She says, "I told my husband I'm not going back there. I'm not going back to that house."
It's a compelling account, one that seemingly absolves Marvin Hogsett of any wrongdoing. Still, Kenda can't help but wonder if Brenda could be covering for Marvin.
That's a pretty good alibi. If it's true, well, let's find out if it's true. So now we got to go find Marvin. Off to Denver we go.
But nothing could prepare Kenda for a confrontation with this suspect. And an account that would lay bare the whole horrible truth about what happened to the Gerardo family.
When this case begins, it's advertised as an animal sacrifice, mass rape, mass murder affair. What does turn out to be true in many ways is even more surprising than the initial claim.
On the morning of January 16th, detectives are searching for the person responsible for killing a family of 5 with their own furnace. Lt.Joe Kenda and his men are closing in on their newest lead, 27-year-old heat and air expert Marvin Hogsett.
He would have had knowledge of heating and ventilation and may have caused the furnace to become a killing machine.
Investigators suspect that landlord Daryl Atkinson might have been Marvin Hogsett's intended victim, seeking payback for being thrown out of their home. And Sophie Gerardo and the 4 children were simply collateral damage. But according to Marvin's estranged wife, Brenda, she and Marvin suffered a similar, near-lethal attack of carbon monoxide.
So let's find out if he did tamper with the furnace like the landlord said he could have. I want to talk to him.
That afternoon, Kenda tracks Marvin to his home in Denver.
Can I help you? Marvin? Yeah. How you doing, Lt.Joe Kenda, Homicide Department?
There, he immediately brings up the furnace in question.
You guys had some issues?
We both had a bad case of carbon monoxide poisoning. They said we actually almost died from it.
He says they took us to Memorial Hospital. They kept us there for 7 or 8 hours till they cleared all that out of our systems and got us some good oxygen.
And Marvin claims he can prove it.
I think I've got a bill around here if you want to see it.
Can I see it?
Absolutely.
Emergency services were called. They were transported to the hospital by way of ambulance.
It seems Marvin's alibi is rock solid. After all, why would the former tenant tamper with the furnace in order to make himself the first victim?
So he became a person of non-interest at that moment. He's not my guy.
Still, the prior incident is enough to convince Kenda that Marvin could be the killer's true target. Kenda asks Marvin if he has any idea who might have tampered with the furnace. According to Marvin, there can only be one culprit: his former landlord, Daryl Atkinson.
Marvin says, I called him, and I told him that appliance was bad. Atkinson arrives, comes into the house. Atkinson says to him, this furnace is no good. It's old. I need to fix it.
Kenda is stunned. The elderly landlord seemed like the last person anyone would accuse of a 5-count homicide.
He impressed me as a pleasant little old man, retired fireman, hard-working. Everything about him is completely appropriate. Why would he do something like that?
But Kenda quickly discovers that Daryl Atkinson's motive probably had little to do with murder and everything to do with money.
Marvin says, this guy Atkinson is the ultimate cheapskate. If it needs fixing, he doesn't call a licensed heating contractor or a plumber or anything else. He fixes it himself as cheaply as he possibly can.
It's an eye-opening theory, one that pins the death of Sophie Gerardo and her family squarely on Daryl Atkinson.
Atkinson told me he's never had a problem with these appliances. Never had an issue with anything.
Once he was caught in a lie, and there was more than one witness to substantiate the fact that he had knowledge of the inoperative furnace, and he was denying that, then we have a problem.
I'm no longer in a quandary about who my man is. It's a 72-year-old landlord. I'm prepared now to arrest him.
With no clear evidence of intent to injure or kill Sophie and her family, Kenda decides to confront Daryl Atkinson. At 11 a.m., Kenda is knocking on the landlord's door.
Oh, hey, detective, come on in.
Inside, he lays out the charges against him.
Daryl, the reason I'm here, I believe you're directly responsible for the death of those 5 people.
How? What do you mean?
I said, Daryl, let me tell you what I think you did. I think you went and got a part. A heat exchanger for that old furnace. And then you put it in yourself. Because you were going to save the money. You had no idea what you were doing. None whatsoever. So you beat that thing into place with a hammer until you got it in there far enough to kill 5 people. You saved your $100, Daryl. You really started the ball when I said that. And I knew I was right.
It was just an honest mistake.
When confronted with the truth, Atkinson breaks down.
I didn't mean to do it. I didn't know it was in backwards. It was an accident.
He didn't want to own his responsibility and accountability after the deaths. He wanted to distance himself from what happened.
He continues to cry. He looks at me again and he says, if the court thinks I did something wrong, I'll take my medicine. Well, that's good, Daryl, because there's going to be some medicine involved.
What happens now?
You'll probably make bond.
He's still crying. He looks at me. He says, what's my bond going to be? I don't know, Daryl. Probably $20,000 in cash. Goes to a coffee can on his stove and takes $20,000 in $100 bills out of the can. There's still plenty of money in the can. Daryl has done a terrible thing, and he's going to have to pay a price for that. Take him to jail, book him in.
Daryl Atkinson posts bail and is released on his own recognizance. A day later, Kenda gets a strange call.
The usual frantic police dispatcher. Suspicious death, possible code 9. Cop talk for murder. What's the address?
Kenda makes an alarming connection.
Is that Daryl Atkinson's residence?
404 East Caramel Street. That's where Atkinson lives. All the way there, I'm thinking, don't let it be the old man. Come on, not that. Something else.
But on arriving at the scene, Kenda immediately recognizes the victim, as well as the cause of death.
There he sits behind the wheel, pink and white, just like Sophie and her kids. He killed himself in the same way he killed that family. Carbon monoxide poisoning.
I think the person who realized better than anyone how senseless and horrible it was Daryl Atkinson. It was essentially a self-imposed death penalty.
Atkinson's suicide is a far steeper sentence than any judge would have handed down. Still, news of the landlord's death comes as little comfort to the loved ones of Sophie Gerardo and her family. They had other ideas for Atkinson.
I wanted to go stand trial. I wanted to be there in the court. I wanted to go tell him what I thought about him.
For Joe Kenda, the landlord's death is the last of 6 tragedies that could all have been avoided for only $16 apiece. No one should die for that. Not Sophie Gerardo, not 4 innocent children, not even the man who killed them.
Every murder I ever investigated was senseless. But this one stood out.
On his way back to the police station, Kenda makes an unscheduled stop.
I got in my car and I drove to a convenience store. I had stopped smoking. I hadn't smoked a cigarette in 3 years. I walked in and I bought a pack of cigarettes. And I smoked every cigarette in that pack. Atkinson wasn't a monster. He was a silly old man who wanted to protect his money. It was a terrible series of events. And 6 people are dead. I'm not easily overcome. I've been exposed to a lot. But I felt really bad about that.
At exactly 2:17 a.m., the street went quiet in a way that didn't feel natural, as if the city itself had inhaled and refused to breathe out, and somewhere between the hum of a distant tram and the flicker of a failing street lamp, a life ended without a witness brave enough to speak. Berlin, autumn of 2000, newly stitched together after decades of division, a city obsessed with reinvention, with forgetting, with moving forward so fast that it didn't always look down at what it stepped on. The body was found, just before dawn, tucked into the shadow between 2 post-war apartment blocks, a place people walked past every day and never really saw. No scream reported. No gunshot heard. Just a man on cold concrete, jacket half open, eyes staring at a sky that was already lightening, as if surprised to see morning arrive at all. Police radios crackled awake as the first patrol car rolled in, blue lights washing the grey walls in pulses that felt almost theatrical, like a crime scene staged for the city rather than discovered. The victim's wallet was still in his pocket. Cash untouched. Keys still clenched in his hand. No obvious sign of a struggle, no overturned trash bins, no broken bottles, no scattered footprints screaming chaos. It was neat. Too neat. The kind of scene that makes investigators uneasy, because it suggests control, intention, someone who knew exactly how much noise they could afford to make. Someone who understood timing. Someone who vanished before anyone realized they had been there at all. His name would be released later that day, carried by local radio, and printed in tight columns in the afternoon papers. 34 years old. Recently moved to Berlin. Worked irregular hours. Known by neighbors as quiet, polite, forgettable in the way people in big cities often are. The kind of man you recognize only after someone points him out. The kind of man whose death shocks a community precisely because no one feels they truly knew him. Flowers would appear by the end of the week, wrapped in plastic, candles melting into small wax puddles that stained the pavement, each one a quiet question left unanswered. The medical examiner would find no easy explanation. No clean narrative. Cause of death determined, yes, but method blurred at the edges, as if the violence had been deliberately muted. No defensive wounds that told a clear story. No weapon left behind. Time of death estimated, not known. Even the blood patterns refused to cooperate, offering suggestions instead of answers. Every detail seemed to say the same thing. This was not random, and yet it left nothing solid to hold on to. Berlin's homicide unit took the case. Seasoned detectives, who had seen the city at its worst and its strangest, men and women who had worked murders in abandoned factories, along canal banks, in luxury apartments, and underground clubs that pulsed all night and pretended to forget everything by morning. They photographed the scene, measured distances, bagged cigarette butts that may or may not have belonged to anyone involved, and knocked on doors while residents pulled on bathrobes and tried to remember if they had heard anything unusual. Most hadn't. Or said they hadn't. One neighbor mentioned footsteps. Another recalled a car engine, maybe. A third swore there had been voices, low, urgent, but couldn't say from where or in what language. Berlin was a city of voices layered on top of each other, and memory was a fragile thing. As the sun climbed higher, the street returned to life with almost insulting normalcy. People walked dogs. Children waited for school buses. Someone complained about the police tape blocking their usual route. The body was removed, zipped into anonymity, and taken away, leaving behind only chalk marks and a damp patch on the pavement that would darken and fade as the day went on. By evening, it would look like nothing had happened at all. But something had happened. Something that refused to settle into a file or a theory. Investigators traced the victim's last known movements, reconstructing his final hours through receipts, phone records, and half-remembered sightings. He had been out late. Where exactly, no one could say for sure. A bar near Alexanderplatz, maybe. A visit to someone he didn't mention to friends. A walk that took him off his usual route home. Each possibility branched into another set of questions, another corridor with doors that led nowhere. CCTV cameras were checked, but the coverage was spotty, angles wrong, footage grainy and frustratingly incomplete. Faces blurred into crowds. Shadows stretched and dissolved. Time slipped through the gaps. The press circled quickly, as it always does, hungry for a narrative that could be condensed into a headline. Berlin cold case begins, one paper ran, prematurely branding it as unsolvable before the investigation had even warmed up. Another focused on the city itself, asking whether Berlin's rapid transformation had created blind spots, spaces where violence could hide unnoticed. Talk radio speculated. Callers phoned in with theories, some sincere, some unhinged, most impossible to verify. Every unsolved murder attracts its own mythology, and this one was no different. But beneath the noise, the detectives kept working, combing through the victim's life with a care that bordered on invasive, because sometimes the smallest detail is the one that breaks everything open. They spoke to co-workers who described him as reliable but private. To friends who admitted they hadn't seen him as much lately. To family members who lived far away and struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the man now described in police reports. No known enemies. No documented threats. No obvious reason for someone to want him dead. That absence, that hollow center, became the most disturbing clue of all. Murders make sense, investigators like to believe, when you find the motive. When you can say why. This one refused to explain itself. Weeks turned into months, and the initial urgency softened into routine. Leads were followed and quietly dropped. A possible witness recanted. A tip about a suspicious acquaintance collapsed under scrutiny. Forensic tests came back inconclusive, again and again, each report ending with language that hedged and qualified, careful not to promise what it could not deliver. The file grew thicker, heavier, a physical manifestation of effort without resolution. Detectives rotated off the case, new names added to the paperwork, each one hoping to see something the others had missed. The community felt it too, that slow shift from shock to uneasy acceptance. The candles disappeared. The flowers dried up. The chalk marks were washed away by rain. Life, relentless and indifferent, moved forward. But the questions lingered in quieter ways, in the way people locked their doors a little faster, glanced over their shoulders on empty streets, wondered about the strangers passing them on the sidewalk. An unsolved homicide has a way of infecting its surroundings, seeping into the collective consciousness like a low-grade fever. By the time the first anniversary came and went, the case had acquired a label that no investigator ever wants to see attached to their work. Cold case. The words sounded clinical, almost gentle, but they carried weight. They meant resources were scarce. That attention had shifted elsewhere. That the chances of resolution were shrinking with every passing day. And yet, officially, the case remained open, its status suspended between effort and abandonment, like a door left ajar in a dark room. Years later, when someone would finally stamp the file with the word closed, it would not mean justice had been served. It would not mean answers had been found. It would mean something far more unsettling, that the city had decided, quietly and without ceremony, to stop asking. And somewhere in Berlin, the silence that began at 2:17 a.m. would continue to echo, unanswered, unresolved, waiting for someone to listen closely enough to hear what it had been trying to say all along. The file didn't go cold all at once. It cooled gradually, like metal left outside overnight, still warm to the touch at first, then impossible to tell when the heat finally vanished. In the weeks after the murder, detectives kept circling the same details, hoping repetition would turn familiarity into revelation. The alley where the body was found was mapped and remapped, distances measured again, as if the concrete itself might confess. From the nearest bar to the corner bakery, from the tram stop to the victim's apartment door, every step was timed, every route tested. Nothing lined up cleanly. There were too many ways he could have ended up there, and none that explained why he didn't make it home. The victim's apartment became a secondary crime scene, not because anything obvious was missing, but because absence has its own language. Drawers were opened and left open. A half-finished cup of coffee sat in the sink, stained dark at the bottom, suggesting a morning that never came. On the small kitchen table lay a folded piece of paper with a phone number written in blue ink, no name attached. Investigators traced it, only to find it belonged to a prepaid mobile phone, activated months earlier and now permanently silent. Another door closed. Another corridor ending in brick. Phone records painted a picture that was frustratingly incomplete. Calls to co-workers. Calls to family. Gaps where there should have been something more. Text messages that stopped abruptly the night he died, mid-conversation, as if the future had been cut cleanly away. Analysts pored over timestamps, triangulated cell towers, tried to pin him to a location with mathematical certainty, but the data refused to behave. Signals overlapped. Towers covered too much ground. Berlin's dense infrastructure, so efficient in daily life, became an obstacle in death. He could have been anywhere within a wide radius, walking, waiting, meeting someone no one knew about. Witness appeals went out on local television, grainy footage of the alley looping behind a calm police spokesperson urging anyone with information to come forward. The response was immediate and overwhelming, and mostly useless. People reported arguments they had overheard weeks earlier. Strangers who looked suspicious in hindsight. Dreams that felt real enough to mention. Tips poured in, each one logged, each one briefly raising hope before collapsing under scrutiny. Detectives learned to recognize the moment when a promising lead began to rot, when the details stopped aligning and the story revealed itself as coincidence, imagination, or misremembered noise. One tip, however, lingered longer than the others. A taxi driver claimed he had picked up a man matching the victim's description late that night, near a club on the other side of the district. The passenger had been agitated, pacing the sidewalk before getting in, checking his watch repeatedly. According to the driver, the man took a phone call mid-ride, his voice low and tense, using short sentences in a language the driver couldn't identify. He asked to be dropped off early, near a residential block that wasn't his own. Investigators traced the route, searched for cameras, tried to verify the driver's account. But memory is elastic, especially when stretched by time and attention. The taxi company's logs were incomplete. The club's security footage had been overwritten. The tip hovered in the file like a ghost, never quite solid enough to chase, never quite dead enough to dismiss. As months passed, the investigation began to feel like it was running in place. Detectives interviewed the same people again, asking the same questions in slightly different ways, hoping fatigue might loosen a truth that politeness had kept hidden. Some witnesses grew defensive. Others grew tired. A few stopped returning calls altogether. The victim's family, initially cooperative and hopeful, began to show signs of strain. Phone conversations turned brittle. Meetings ended with long silences. They wanted answers, not process, not explanations about how complex cases take time. Each day without progress felt like a second loss. Internally, theories multiplied. A robbery gone wrong, discarded because nothing was taken. A personal dispute, unsupported by evidence. A random act of violence, statistically possible, but emotionally unsatisfying. One detective suggested the scene felt staged, not theatrically, but practically, as if someone had chosen that specific spot, because it offered the right combination of darkness and invisibility. Another pointed out how quickly the perpetrator must have left, how little disturbance was left behind. They argued late into the night, voices echoing in the squad room, papers spread across desks, like the remains of an autopsy performed on time itself. Berlin at the turn of the millennium was a city in flux, its identity shifting faster than its institutions could keep up. Old neighborhoods were being renovated, repurposed, renamed. People arrived and disappeared with ease, leaving behind little more than forwarding addresses that led nowhere. Investigators suspected the killer might have been transient, someone who slipped through the city without leaving enough of a trace to follow. The idea was both plausible and terrifying. How do you catch someone who doesn't need to stay? The forensic reports offered no comfort. Advances that would later become standard were still years away. DNA samples were partial, degraded, or inconclusive. They were catalogued and stored, promises sealed in plastic, waiting for a future that might know what to do with them. Fingerprints lifted from nearby surfaces matched no one in the system. Every negative result felt like another door closing, another confirmation that the past was better at hiding than the present was at searching. By the second year, the case had changed shape. It no longer dominated briefings or demanded daily updates. It became a reference point, a cautionary tale mentioned in passing. New cases arrived, loud and urgent, dragging resources and attention with them. The unsolved homicide was relegated to a shelf, not forgotten, but no longer front and center. Detectives told themselves this was temporary, that breakthroughs often come when you least expect them. But hope, stretched too thin, begins to resemble denial. Occasionally, something would stir it back to life. An anonymous letter, postmarked from another city, describing details that sounded convincing until they were checked and found wanting. A reported sighting of someone resembling the victim, years later, in a different country, fueling speculation that he might not have died at all, that the body had been misidentified. The theory collapsed under forensic certainty, but for a brief moment, it reignited the collective imagination, a reminder of how desperate people were for any ending other than this one. The victim's name faded from headlines, replaced by newer tragedies, but in the neighborhood where he died, the alley retained a reputation. People avoided it at night, Parents warned children to take longer routes home. The space itself seemed to carry a residue, an unspoken understanding that something bad had happened there and had never been properly accounted for. Urban legends sprouted in the absence of facts, stories told and retold until the original details were unrecognizable, but the fear remained intact. Inside the police department, the case became a test of endurance. Younger officers studied it as part of their training, flipping through the thick binder, learning how easily investigations can stall when motive evaporates and witnesses dissolve. Veterans used it as a reminder of humility, of the limits of experience and intuition. Every so often, someone would suggest reopening old leads, revisiting assumptions, but without new information, the exercise felt like chasing reflections in dark glass. Time did what time always does. It wore down edges. It blurred faces. It softened outrage into melancholy. When the decision was finally made to formally close the case, it happened without fanfare, a bureaucratic action justified by resource allocation and statistical probability. The stamp landed heavily on the file, final and impersonal. Closed. Not solved. Closed. For the city, it was an administrative footnote. For the family, it was a wound reopened and sealed at the same time, an official acknowledgement that no one was coming with answers. For the investigators who had lived with the case, it was a quiet defeat, one they would carry into other investigations, always wondering what they had missed, which question they should have asked one more time. And for the alley, for that narrow strip of concrete between two buildings that had seen everything and said nothing, the silence remained unbroken. Night after night, footsteps passed through it, unaware or pretending to be, while somewhere beneath the ordinary sounds of a living city, the unanswered question lingered, patient, unresolved, waiting for a moment that might never come. Years after the file was stamped and shelved, the case continued to breathe in small, inconvenient ways, surfacing when no one expected it, refusing to stay buried. It appeared in late-night conversations between detectives who had moved on to other cities, other crimes, other lives. It crept into academic discussions about unsolved homicides in transitional urban spaces, cited without emotion, stripped of names, reduced to data points and probabilities. And sometimes, without warning, it returned to Berlin itself, dragged back into the light by chance, by memory, by the quiet insistence of something unfinished. One winter, nearly a decade after the murder, construction crews began tearing up streets not far from the alley. Berlin was still rebuilding, still reshaping itself, still excavating layers of history, with the same casual brutality it applied to old buildings. A worker found a rusted object buried beneath compacted soil, initially dismissed as debris. When it was cleaned, catalogued, passed along, it turned out to be nothing of consequence. Not a weapon. Not evidence. Just another reminder of how often the city produces false alarms, how hope flares and dies in the same breath. Still, the police logged it, because that's what they did. Because even after closure, procedure demanded respect for the possibility of surprise. The victim's family never stopped asking questions, even when they learned to stop expecting answers. They marked anniversaries privately, without press, without statements. Photographs were kept in drawers, taken out and studied late at night when sleep refused to come. They replayed conversations, scanned old letters, searched for clues in jokes that suddenly felt weighted, in silences that now seemed suspicious. Grief has a way of turning memory into an investigation of its own, one with no jurisdiction, and no statute of limitations. Occasionally, someone would come forward claiming to know something, emboldened by distance, by age, by the belief that enough time had passed to make confessions safe. Most stories collapsed quickly. People exaggerated their proximity to the crime, mistook rumor for experience, or sought attention in the reflected glare of tragedy. Each claim was evaluated, each disappointment added to a long list of near misses that left everyone involved a little more tired, a little more skeptical. Hope, once burned too often, learns to hide. The city itself changed almost beyond recognition. New cafes replaced old bars. Surveillance cameras multiplied, watching streets that had once existed in blind spots. What had been shadows in 2000 were now brightly lit, monitored, mapped. Younger residents walked past the alley without knowing what had happened there, unaware that it had once been the center of a small universe of fear and speculation. Urban memory is selective, and Berlin, more than most cities, had learned how to forget in order to survive. Inside police archives, the case file aged quietly. Paper yellowed. Ink faded. Technologies that once seemed advanced became obsolete. The DNA samples, still stored, still labeled, waited for a future that might, or might not arrive. Every few years, someone ran them through updated systems, hoping progress would do what persistence could not. The results remained the same. No match. No name. Just a reminder that science, like justice, has its limits. Former detectives spoke about the case with a mixture of frustration and reverence. It had taught them lessons they carried into every investigation afterward. Trust your instincts, but verify everything. Don't ignore the quiet details. Understand that some crimes are designed to leave nothing behind. One officer admitted, years later, that the neatness of the scene still haunted him. The lack of chaos. The absence of panic. It suggested a killer who was calm, deliberate, and confident enough to believe they would never be caught. That kind of confidence, he said, is the most dangerous thing of all. Speculation persisted in the margins. Amateur investigators dissected the limited information available, constructing elaborate theories that ranged from organized crime, to political conspiracy, to crimes of passion disguised as something else entirely. Online forums buzzed briefly, then fell silent, revived occasionally by new users who believed fresh eyes could see what professionals had missed. Each theory added layers of noise, obscuring the few solid facts that remained. Truth, buried beneath interpretation, became harder to reach with every retelling. The alley remained, stubborn and unchanged in its basic shape, even as the buildings around it were renovated and repainted. At night, it still collected shadows. Footsteps still echoed strangely there, amplified, distorted. Some residents claimed it felt colder than the surrounding streets, an illusion, perhaps, but one that persisted. Places remember, even when people try not to. The city may forget, but concrete does not. When the 20th anniversary arrived, a small local paper ran a brief piece, more obituary than investigation. It recounted the bare facts, noted the case's unresolved status, quoted a retired detective who said, simply, that not all questions get answers. There was no public outcry, no renewed push. The article disappeared beneath newer headlines within hours. Time had dulled the edge of outrage, sanding it down until it fit neatly into the past. And yet, the case continued to exert a quiet pull. For some, it represented the ultimate failure of order, a reminder that even in cities saturated with cameras, databases, and procedures, a single person can commit an act of violence and vanish completely. For others, it was a personal wound, a story without an ending that refused to settle into memory. It lingered because it had never been explained, never neutralized by narrative. The official designation of closed remained a technicality, a bureaucratic decision rather than a moral one. It meant no more active investigation, no more dedicated resources. It did not mean the truth had been uncovered. It did not mean the killer was dead or imprisoned or remorseful. It meant only that the system had reached the limits of what it was willing, or able, to do. Some nights, former investigators admitted, they still replayed the scene in their minds, rearranging details, imagining different sequences of events. What if the victim had taken a different route? What if a neighbor had looked out the window at the right moment? What if one small piece of evidence had been recognized for what it was instead of dismissed? These questions have no expiration date. They follow those who ask them long after the job is done. The unanswered homicide became part of Berlin's invisible history, one of many stories layered beneath the surface of a city known for reinvention. It existed in archives and memories, in whispers and footnotes, in the uncomfortable knowledge that some truths remain stubbornly out of reach. The victim's life, reduced to a case number and a handful of photographs, continued to cast a shadow disproportionate to its official status. And so the story endured, not as a solved crime or a triumphant investigation, but as an absence, a negative space where answers should have been. A reminder that closure is not the same as resolution, that silence can be louder than confession, and that somewhere in the vast, shifting anatomy of a modern city, a secret can survive intact, waiting, patient, untouched by time. The longer the case remained unanswered, the more it began to distort the memories around it, like heat bending the air above asphalt. People who had lived near the alley in 2000 started to remember things differently, their recollections subtly reshaped by years of speculation, by stories heard secondhand, by the human need to turn uncertainty into something that at least feels coherent. A shadow once ignored became a suspicious figure. A sound dismissed as traffic transformed into a muffled argument. Memory, once altered, insisted on its own truth. Former neighbors were re-interviewed years later for unrelated matters, and the murder surfaced again, uninvited. Some claimed they had always known something was wrong that night. Others admitted they had been afraid to speak at the time, afraid of being wrong, afraid of getting involved, afraid of what might happen if they said too much. Fear, investigators knew, is one of the most reliable accomplices a crime can have. It doesn't need to plan or act. It just needs to convince people to stay silent. One woman, now elderly, recalled seeing a man standing at the corner near the alley shortly before dawn, smoking, unmoving, as if waiting for something. She had noticed him because he didn't look like he belonged there, because his stillness felt deliberate. But she hadn't reported it then. By the time she spoke up, years later, she couldn't describe his face, his clothes, or even be certain of the date. The image floated in her mind without anchors, impossible to attach to reality. Investigators noted it anyway, another fragment added to the mosaic that never quite formed a picture. The victim's digital footprint, sparse by modern standards, became a source of renewed interest as technology evolved. Old email accounts were re-examined. Archived servers were searched. Passwords cracked with permission from family members desperate for anything that might explain the last hours of his life. Messages surfaced that were mundane, work-related, casual exchanges with acquaintances. And then there were the gaps. Deleted threads. Missing days. Empty spaces that could mean nothing or everything. Absence again, asserting itself as the dominant theme. One recovered email, sent weeks before the murder, drew particular attention. It was vague, almost throwaway, referencing a meeting that needed to happen soon, and an unease the writer couldn't quite articulate. No names. No locations. Just a tone that felt different from his usual correspondence. Investigators tried to trace the recipient, but the address led to a defunct account. Another dead end, but one that lingered, because tone is harder to dismiss than facts. It suggested anticipation. Or dread. Berlin's undercurrents were shifting in those years, with informal economies, nightlife, and transient communities intersecting in ways that resisted oversight. The victim's irregular work hours placed him on the city's edges, moving through spaces that were crowded and anonymous, then suddenly empty. Detectives revisited the idea that he had crossed paths with someone dangerous without realizing it, someone who mistook opportunity for invitation. The theory explained the randomness, but not the precision. Crimes of chance are usually messy. This one had been controlled. Retired officers who had worked organized crime cases in the late 1990s weighed in unofficially, offering impressions rather than evidence. They talked about the discipline required to leave so little behind, about how rare that kind of restraint was outside certain circles. But no links could be drawn. No patterns matched. The city's criminal landscape was chaotic, fragmented, not known for quiet efficiency. The murder remained an anomaly, resistant to classification. Meanwhile, the family carried the weight in private. Birthdays passed. Holidays accumulated. Each milestone became a reminder of what was missing, of a life that had ended abruptly and without explanation. They avoided the alley when they visited Berlin, taking longer routes, choosing cafes farther away. Yet it was always there in their minds, a fixed point around which everything else rotated. They wanted answers, but more than that, they wanted meaning. Something to make the loss intelligible. Psychologists consulted by the police spoke about unresolved cases as open loops, narratives the brain cannot complete. They described how communities respond, how rumors fill gaps, how suspicion can spread without direction, attaching itself to strangers, to outsiders, to anyone who fits the shape of fear. In the neighborhood, subtle tensions had lingered for years, an unspoken awareness that someone had done something terrible and had never been held accountable. Trust erodes quietly, grain by grain. Every few years, the possibility of reopening the case surfaced during internal reviews, usually prompted by a technological advance or a new perspective. Each time, the same obstacles emerged. Witnesses were older, memories thinner. Physical evidence was limited and had already been examined exhaustively. Without a catalyst, reopening the investigation risked raising expectations only to dash them again. The decision was always postponed, then quietly dismissed. Yet the idea of closure remained elusive, because closure suggests finality, and nothing about the case felt final. The official word sat uneasily alongside the persistent sense that something essential had been missed. That somewhere, in a conversation never recorded or a gesture never noticed, the truth had passed close enough to be seen, then slipped away. The alley itself became a kind of accidental memorial, not marked by plaques or flowers, but by avoidance. Taxi drivers skipped it at night. Delivery workers hurried through. New residents sensed its reputation, without being told, absorbing it through tone, through hesitation. Places accumulate meaning through repetition, and this one repeated the same message endlessly. Something happened here, and it was never resolved. In moments of honesty, some investigators admitted that what troubled them most was not the lack of evidence, but the lack of noise. No dramatic confrontation. No public breakdown. No obvious ripple. The victim had vanished from the city's rhythm with barely a disturbance, as if his life had been quietly erased rather than violently taken. It challenged assumptions about how crime announces itself, about how suffering demands attention. This suffering had been almost polite. Speculation turned inward as years passed. Instead of asking who did it, people began to ask what it said about the city. About how easily someone could fall through cracks created by size, speed, and anonymity. Berlin prided itself on openness, on visibility, on being seen and heard. And yet, here was a story defined entirely by what no one saw, what no one heard, what no one could say for sure. The case became a reference point in discussions about urban alienation, about how modern life can render individuals both hypervisible and utterly invisible at the same time. The victim had lived among thousands, worked among dozens, and still managed to die alone, unobserved, unclaimed by narrative. His death exposed a gap between proximity and connection that felt uncomfortably familiar. Even the language around the case began to feel inadequate. Words like unsolved, and closed sounded administrative, distant, incapable of capturing the human cost. They flattened complexity into categories that could be filed and archived. But for those who remembered, truly remembered, the case remained dynamic, alive with unanswered questions, pulsing beneath the surface of everyday life. On certain nights, when the city grew quieter and the streets emptied, the alley seemed to return to its original state, stripped of renovations and repainting, echoing faintly with the past. In those moments, the murder felt close again, not as history, but as presence. A reminder that time does not erase everything. Some things simply learn how to wait. And so the story continued, not advancing, not resolving, but deepening. Layer by layer, it accumulated meaning without explanation, becoming less about who committed the crime and more about what it revealed. About silence. About omission. About the uncomfortable truth that sometimes, even with effort, expertise, and time, the world refuses to make sense. As the years stretched on, the case began to exert a strange gravitational pull on everything adjacent to it, drawing in unrelated events, half-remembered conversations, and coincidences that felt too sharp to ignore. Detectives who no longer officially worked the file still caught themselves listening differently when similar crimes crossed their desks, comparing details instinctively, measuring new violence against that quiet, controlled death in Berlin at the edge of the millennium. Most comparisons failed. Some lingered uncomfortably longer than they should have. There was one homicide, years later, in another district, another city entirely, that briefly reignited internal discussion. Different victim. Different circumstances. But the same absence of chaos. The same economy of movement. The same sense that the perpetrator had arrived knowing exactly how long they could afford to stay. The connection was tempting, almost seductive, but temptation is not evidence. When the other case was solved quickly, its suspect sloppy in ways the Berlin killer had not been, the thread snapped. Still, the echo remained, a reminder that patterns don't always repeat cleanly, and that some killers leave behind impressions rather than signatures. The original case file, though officially dormant, was never truly untouched. Archivists noted when it was requested, when pages were scanned, when photographs were reprinted for lectures or internal reviews. Each access was logged, each name recorded. The list grew slowly, an unintentional census of those who couldn't quite let go. Some were researchers. Some were students. A few were detectives from other jurisdictions, curious, searching for parallels in their own unsolved work. None found what they were looking for. One such request came from a criminologist studying low-noise homicides, a term that sounded clinical, but described something deeply unsettling, killings designed to blend into the background, to leave minimal disruption, to exploit the assumption that violence announces itself loudly. In interviews, she spoke about how modern cities train people to ignore each other, to filter out anomalies as long as they don't demand immediate attention. The Berlin case became a central example in her work, not because of what was known, but because of what wasn't. The silence, she argued, was not accidental. It was structural. The idea unsettled those who had lived near the alley at the time. It suggested that the murder was not just an individual act, but a collaboration with the environment itself. Poor lighting. Predictable routines. The assumption that someone else would notice, someone else would intervene. When those assumptions are shared by everyone, no one acts. The killer, whoever they were, may have understood that instinctively, exploiting it without needing to articulate it. In the victim's personal effects, stored for years and rarely examined, there were objects that took on new weight with time. A notebook with scattered entries, mundane lists, fragments of thoughts that never coalesced into anything clearly meaningful. A train ticket kept longer than necessary, perhaps by habit, perhaps because it marked a meeting, a moment. Investigators had scrutinized these items before, but objects change as context changes. What once looked ordinary can become suspicious when viewed through the lens of loss. One entry in the notebook, barely legible, had been dismissed early on as irrelevant. A date. A time. No explanation. At the time, it matched nothing obvious. Years later, a former detective noticed that the time aligned roughly with the estimated window of death, though on a different day. Coincidence, most likely. But coincidence is the currency of cold cases, traded endlessly, because there is nothing else left. The note was flagged again, discussed briefly, then returned to obscurity. Without a corresponding event, it remained just ink on paper. The family, aware of these occasional flickers of renewed attention, learned to temper their reactions. Each call from police, each email from a journalist, stirred a familiar mix of hope and dread. They wanted progress, but they feared disappointment more. Over time, they stopped initiating contact, choosing instead to wait, to let information come to them if it ever would. Waiting became a way of life, a low-level tension that never fully released. Berlin itself entered a new phase, more polished, more surveilled, more aware of its image. Crime statistics were analyzed publicly. Safety campaigns launched. The city sold itself as open but secure, vibrant but controlled. In that narrative, the unsolved homicide from 2000 had no place. It was inconvenient, an outlier that resisted incorporation into success stories and improvement curves. It existed in the margins, acknowledged only when absolutely necessary. Yet the story refused to disappear completely. It resurfaced in art, indirectly, refracted through metaphor. A short film about a man who vanishes between two buildings. An installation featuring recorded footsteps echoing endlessly in a narrow corridor. None mentioned the case explicitly, but those who knew recognized the influence. Artists, like investigators, are drawn to absence, to the tension created by what cannot be explained. The alley underwent cosmetic changes. New lighting was installed. Walls were repainted. Graffiti came and went. At a glance, it no longer resembled the place captured in crime scene photos. And yet, the dimensions were the same. The distance between walls unchanged. The way sound behaved, the way footsteps seemed to follow you, remained eerily familiar. Physical space, unlike memory, is stubborn. For some former residents, returning to the area triggered unexpected reactions. A tightening in the chest. A sudden awareness of their own vulnerability. They remembered the shock of waking up to police tape, the hushed conversations on stairwells, the way the city had briefly felt dangerous in a new, intimate way. Those feelings had never fully resolved, just been covered over by time and routine. Standing there again peeled back the layers. Among the detectives who had worked the case, a quiet superstition developed. They avoided using the word never when discussing unsolved crimes. Never solved. Never identified. The Berlin case had taught them that certainty is fragile, that declarations can age badly. They preferred, so far, a phrase that left room, however small, for change. It was a professional habit, but also a personal one, a way to protect against the finality that closure implied. Rumors occasionally circulated that someone had confessed privately, on a deathbed, or in a moment of intoxication, only to have the story dissolve under verification. These rumors were impossible to fully disprove and impossible to act on. They existed in that uncomfortable space between possibility and fantasy, sustained by the collective desire for an ending. Every time one surfaced, it briefly rearranged the emotional landscape, then settled back into disappointment. What remained constant was the sense of imbalance. A life had ended violently, and the scales had never been corrected. There was no trial, no verdict, no public accounting. The city absorbed the loss and moved on, but something had been left behind, like a skipped beat in its rhythm. People rarely articulated this feeling, but they responded to it intuitively, with caution, with stories, with a persistent unease that never fully dissipated. The case also raised uncomfortable questions about whose deaths demand resolution, and whose are allowed to fade. The victim was not famous, not powerful, not emblematic of a larger narrative that could be leveraged for reform or outrage. He was ordinary, and perhaps that ordinariness made it easier for the case to slip into the background. Unsolved crimes accumulate unevenly, clustering around the lives least likely to be defended loudly. In professional circles, the murder was sometimes cited as an example of investigative humility. Not every case bends to effort. Not every truth wants to be known. This was not meant as an excuse, but as a recognition of reality's resistance to structure. Still, humility sits uneasily alongside grief. It comforts institutions more than individuals. Late at night, when the city's noise dropped to a low hum, the alley seemed to return to its original function, a passage rather than a destination. People passed through quickly, eyes forward, footsteps accelerating without conscious decision. Something in the space encouraged movement, discouraged pause. Perhaps it always had. Perhaps that was why it had been chosen. The unanswered questions continued to hover, unanchored. Who was he meeting, if anyone? Why there? Why then? Why was no one else involved? Or if they were, why did they vanish so completely? Each question branched into others, a network without a center. The absence of answers became its own presence, shaping how the story was remembered, how it was told, how it refused to end. And so the case persisted in this suspended state, neither active nor forgotten, a quiet anomaly in the city's long, complicated history. It lingered not because of spectacle, but because of restraint. Because of what it withheld. In a world saturated with information, that restraint felt almost aggressive, a refusal to explain itself. The silence that began in the early hours of a Berlin morning continued, undisturbed, carrying forward through renovations, through careers, through generations. It waited in archives and memories, in concrete and habit, unchanged by time's passage. And with every year that passed, the question grew heavier, not lighter, pressing down with the weight of all that had not been said, all that had not been seen, all that remained stubbornly unresolved. With distance came a different kind of scrutiny, less emotional, more forensic, as if time itself had become an investigator, circling the case slowly, looking for fractures everyone else had missed. Younger analysts, trained in an era of data modeling and behavioral profiling, revisited the fragments not as a story, but as a system. They charted timelines, mapped probability clusters, overlaid movement patterns on the city as it existed in 2000, not as it looked now. Berlin back then was rougher at the edges, less illuminated, full of transitional spaces where purpose blurred and oversight thinned. The alley fit perfectly into that geography, a seam between functions, neither destination nor refuge, just a gap. They focused on the hours before the murder, compressing them into a narrow window of vulnerability. Late night into early morning, when fatigue dulls awareness and routine loosens its grip. The victim's movements suggested intention at first, then deviation. A turn taken too late. A stop that wasn't planned. Something had interrupted his trajectory, not violently at first, but convincingly enough that he complied. That conclusion, tentative but persistent, shifted the frame. This wasn't an ambush in the dark. It was an encounter. The idea unsettled those who heard it. Encounters imply interaction, words exchanged, choices made. It suggested the victim had engaged, however briefly, with the person who would end his life. That meant trust, or at least curiosity. It meant the killer didn't need to overpower him immediately. They had time. Time to position him. Time to control the environment. Time to leave without spectacle. Time is the most expensive resource in a crime, and this killer had spent it carefully. Attention returned to the victim's personality, not as biography, but as vulnerability. Quiet. Polite. New to the city. Someone unlikely to escalate a confrontation, more inclined to de-escalate, to listen. These traits, harmless in daily life, can become liabilities in the wrong context. Analysts were careful not to blame the victim, but the reality remained. Certain dispositions attract certain outcomes. The city doesn't discriminate. It simply reacts. The lack of defensive wounds, once merely puzzling, took on new meaning. It suggested compliance until the very end, or a method that neutralized resistance instantly. Both possibilities pointed to a killer who understood human behavior, who knew how to avoid panic, how to keep a situation quiet. This was not rage spilling over. This was containment. Speculation drifted toward professions rather than identities. Someone accustomed to control. Someone familiar with physical proximity. Someone who knew how bodies behave under stress. Theories brushed against uncomfortable categories, then retreated for lack of proof. Profiling without evidence is a dangerous exercise, prone to projection. Still, the exercise continued, because doing nothing felt worse. A retired pathologist revisited the autopsy report years later, and remarked on its restraint. The injuries told a story, he said, but only if you listened carefully. Not a fight. Not a frenzy. A sequence. The body had been moved minimally, positioned rather than discarded. That distinction mattered. It implied intention beyond the act itself, a desire to leave the scene as it was found, or as close to it as possible. A desire to blend the crime into the background. The alley's acoustics were analyzed next. Sound engineers, brought in for an unrelated project, noted how noise behaved there, how voices dropped quickly into dull echoes, how traffic masked sudden sounds. A raised voice might travel a few meters, then dissolve into the city's ambient hum. A brief struggle could be invisible to anyone not looking directly at it. The environment itself was complicit, offering cover without needing to be asked. When these observations were shared with former investigators, reactions were mixed. Some felt vindicated, their early instincts finally articulated in technical language. Others felt a renewed frustration, wishing they had had these tools, this vocabulary, back then. Progress can feel like an accusation when it arrives too late. The family listened to these developments from a distance, cautious but attentive. They had learned not to mistake reinterpretation for resolution. Still, the idea that the crime had structure, that it wasn't random, offered a strange comfort. Randomness is terrifying. Structure implies intent, and intent implies a human agent who made choices, who could, in theory, be known. But theory stalled where evidence refused to follow. No new names emerged. No latent fingerprints suddenly matched. The DNA remained stubbornly anonymous, a biological whisper without a speaker. Each new angle illuminated the absence rather than filling it, sharpening the outline of what was missing. The case began to be discussed less as a failure and more as a boundary, a demonstration of how far investigation can go before it runs out of traction. In training sessions, it was framed as a lesson in limitations. Not everything leaves a trail. Not everyone wants to be found. The city is not a witness, it is a filter. Public interest flickered occasionally, sparked by documentaries about cold cases, by the growing popularity of true crime as entertainment. Producers reached out, hoping to package the story, to dramatize the mystery. The family declined most requests. They didn't want speculation turned into spectacle. They had lived with uncertainty long enough, without watching it be edited for suspense. Still, fragments leaked into the cultural bloodstream. A podcast mentioned the case in passing. A novelist used it as inspiration, thinly veiled. Each retelling simplified something, sharpened something else, until the original facts were barely visible beneath the layers. The real story, already fragile, risked being buried under interpretation. In the police archives, the case file sat unchanged, its physical weight constant even as its meaning evolved. It was heavy not because of what it contained, but because of what it lacked. Every page testified to effort. Every absence testified to restraint, to a crime that had been engineered to leave as little behind as possible. One analyst suggested, quietly, that the killer might not have seen the act as murder in the conventional sense. That they might have rationalized it, compartmentalized it, framed it as necessity or correction. This wasn't psychology so much as pattern recognition, an attempt to understand how someone could act so calmly. The suggestion lingered uncomfortably, because it implied the killer might still be out there, integrated into ordinary life, untroubled. That possibility haunted those who thought about the case too long. It raised the specter of proximity, of sharing sidewalks and trams with someone capable of such precision. But Berlin was a city of millions. Probability diluted fear. People moved on. The alley, for its part, remained indifferent. It had no memory of the analysis, no awareness of its role in academic debates or police training. It simply existed, doing what it had always done, connecting two streets, offering passage, absorbing footsteps. The city flowed around it, and through it, without pause. Sometimes, late at night, someone would stop there, unintentionally, drawn by nothing more than fatigue or curiosity. They might feel a vague unease, a pressure to keep moving, an instinct they couldn't quite explain. They would leave quickly, never knowing why they had hurried, never knowing what had once unfolded in that narrow space. The case had reached a strange equilibrium. Not active, not dormant. Not forgotten, not remembered clearly. It existed in a state of tension, sustained by questions that no longer demanded answers, but refused to disappear. The official record said closed, but the story remained open in every way that mattered. What lingered most was the sense of precision, of deliberate invisibility. In a world that equates violence with chaos, this crime stood apart, defined by its quiet. It challenged assumptions, unsettled narratives, resisted closure not through complexity, but through simplicity. It had taken place, cleanly and efficiently, and then it had stopped. And that, perhaps, was the most disturbing part. Not the brutality, but the restraint. Not the mystery, but the control. The realization that sometimes, the hardest crimes to solve are not those that explode into public view, but those that slip between moments, barely noticed, leaving behind only a question that grows heavier with time. The city continued to rebuild, to illuminate, to record. Data accumulated. Cameras multiplied. The future grew louder, more observable, less forgiving of anonymity. But the past remained untouched, sealed in the early hours of a Berlin morning when the street went quiet, and no one heard the moment when a life crossed the line between presence and absence. That silence, refined by years of analysis and still unbroken, settled back into place, as patient as ever, waiting to see if time would eventually force it to speak. As the city grew louder with data and light, the case grew quieter in a different way, retreating from public awareness, and settling into the private mental spaces of those who still carried it. The murder stopped being a question people asked out loud and became something they thought about only when reminded, like an old scar that tightens in cold weather. It was there always, but rarely acknowledged directly. A generation had passed since that morning in 2000, and with it came a subtle shift in perspective. Younger officers, born after the crime, encountered the case as history rather than failure. To them, it was a snapshot of an earlier investigative era, constrained by tools and assumptions that now seemed almost primitive. They read the reports with curiosity instead of frustration, noting what was missing as much as what was present. Their distance made them analytical, but also dangerously confident. Hindsight is persuasive. They questioned early decisions, not accusatory, just methodical. Why this witness over that one? Why certain theories were abandoned so quickly? Why the alley was treated as a terminal point rather than a transition? These weren't criticisms so much as exercises, ways to train the mind to see alternatives. Still, every alternative led back to the same wall. Without new input, revision remained academic. One of these officers suggested something that unsettled the room, that the crime might not have been the killer's first, nor their last, but the only one that disappeared completely. Others may have been solved, misattributed, or lost in jurisdictions that never compared notes. The idea introduced a chilling asymmetry. What if this wasn't an anomaly, but an outlier in visibility rather than behavior? What if the killer's mistake was not in committing murder, but in committing one that left no trail? Cross-border data sharing improved dramatically in the years that followed, but too late to capture the ephemeral movements of the early 2000s. Travel records were incomplete. Identification standards varied. A person could pass through cities and countries leaving behind nothing more than a paper trail that no longer existed. The killer, if transient, may have exploited that moment in history perfectly, slipping through gaps that have since closed. Attention returned, briefly, to the victim's final phone activity. Analysts noticed that one call, short and unremarkable on its face, originated from a location that didn't quite align with the rest of his movements. The discrepancy was small, easily explained by signal bounce or tower overlap, and it had been dismissed at the time. Re-examined years later, it suggested a pause, a moment where he stayed still long enough for the signal to settle. Waiting, perhaps. Or listening. The number dialed was untraceable, another prepaid phone that vanished into obsolescence. But the timing lingered. It fell within a window where no one could account for him, a quiet gap that had always existed but now felt sharper. If he had been waiting, the question was for whom? And if he had been listening, what had been said? Psychological profiling returned to the foreground, stripped of earlier speculation, and rebuilt from behavior alone. The killer's restraint suggested experience, not necessarily criminal, but situational. Someone comfortable managing stress, capable of maintaining composure under pressure. Not impulsive. Not intoxicated. Not driven by emotion alone. This wasn't a loss of control. It was its opposite. The notion challenged comforting narratives. People prefer to believe that violence announces itself through visible instability, through anger or desperation that can be spotted and avoided. This case suggested something colder, more unsettling, that harm can be delivered by someone who blends in perfectly, who knows when to speak and when to stay silent, who understands the value of patience. The family, now older, received fewer updates, because there were fewer updates to give. They marked the passing years with a quiet resilience that looked, from the outside, like acceptance, but was closer to endurance. They didn't expect answers anymore. They hoped for them, in the abstract, but hope had become something they rationed carefully. When asked by journalists whether they believed the case would ever be solved, they answered honestly. They didn't know. Certainty, they had learned, was a luxury reserved for people who hadn't lived with unanswered questions. For them, the unknown had become part of the landscape, something you navigate rather than conquer. Berlin continued to absorb new residents, new languages, new rhythms. The city that had existed in 2000 was now a memory itself, preserved in photographs and anecdotes. The murder belonged to that older Berlin, one that younger citizens could barely imagine. Without a living context, the crime lost its immediacy, becoming a historical footnote rather than a current threat. Yet the emotional residue remained, particularly among those who had been close to the investigation. Retired detectives spoke about it rarely, but when they did, their voices changed. The case represented a professional wound, not because of what they had done wrong, but because of what they had been unable to do at all. Solving crimes is as much about identity as outcome, and unsolved cases leave dents. One former investigator admitted that the case had altered how he walked through cities. He noticed alleys more, paid attention to lighting, registered how sound carried in narrow spaces. He had learned to see urban environments as collaborators, capable of shaping outcomes without intention. The lessons stayed with him long after the paperwork ended. Occasionally, someone would suggest that the truth might already be known, privately, by someone who chose not to speak. A friend. A stranger. A passerby who noticed something, but decided it wasn't their problem. This possibility was perhaps the hardest to accept, because it implicated not systems or technology, but individuals. Silence, once again, emerged as the most powerful force in the story. The case became an example in ethics discussions about bystander responsibility, about how cities normalize disengagement as a survival strategy. When surrounded by strangers, involvement feels risky. Non-involvement feels safe. The Berlin homicide exposed the cost of that calculation, measured not in theory, but in a life. Despite everything, the idea of resolution never fully died. It changed shape, becoming less about arrests and trials and more about recognition. Acknowledgement that the crime happened. That it mattered. That it left a mark. In that sense, the continued telling of the story, however fragmented, served a purpose. It resisted erasure. The alley remained unchanged in function, even as the buildings around it aged and renewed themselves. It still connected two streets, still funneled foot traffic, still created a brief moment of isolation in an otherwise crowded city. Its ordinariness was its defining feature. Nothing marked it as dangerous. Nothing warned passers-by of its history. That, too, was part of the lesson. The case, by its nature, refused to teach anything cleanly. It offered no clear moral, no satisfying conclusion. Instead, it presented a series of tensions, between visibility and anonymity, between effort and outcome, between knowledge and certainty. It forced those who engaged with it to sit with discomfort rather than resolve it. As time continued its steady march forward, the murder receded further into the past, but it did not dissolve. It persisted in the spaces between attention and neglect, in the uneasy awareness that some acts of violence are designed not to shock, but to disappear. And in that disappearance, they leave behind a different kind of damage, one that spreads quietly, indefinitely. The silence that followed the crime had changed over the years, shaped by analysis and memory, but it had never broken. It stretched across decades, resilient and intact, a reminder that some stories do not end. They simply continue, unresolved, carried forward by those who remember and by those who don't even know they should. And somewhere within that silence, the question remained unspoken but heavy, not who committed the crime, or even why, but how something so deliberate could leave behind so little, and what that absence said about the city, the time, and the people who moved through it without ever knowing how close they had come to the truth. At some point, the case stopped feeling like a puzzle and started to feel like a mirror. Those who studied it closely began to notice how often their own assumptions crept into the gaps, how easily interpretation filled space where evidence refused to go. The murder didn't just resist explanation, it reflected the biases of anyone who tried to explain it. Every theory said as much about the theorist as it did about the crime. In closed-door discussions, analysts talked about narrative gravity, the human tendency to pull events toward familiar shapes. Serial killer. Organized crime. Personal dispute. Each offered comfort through structure, a promise that chaos could be tamed by category. But the Berlin homicide refused to settle into any of them. It hovered between types, borrowing elements without committing to form. That ambiguity was its power. One overlooked detail resurfaced during a routine audit of archived materials. A photograph, taken at the scene but never emphasized, showed a faint mark on a nearby wall, barely visible beneath grime and old paint. At the time, it had been dismissed as incidental, urban wear and tear. Years later, when the image was digitally enhanced for preservation, the mark appeared more deliberate, a smear at roughly shoulder height, inconsistent with casual contact. It suggested proximity. Movement. A moment when someone leaned, braced, or steadied themselves. The finding was quietly circulated among a small group of experts. Could it have been left by the victim? Or by someone else? The direction of the smear hinted at force applied and then released. Not violent enough to attract attention, but not accidental either. It was the kind of detail that meant nothing alone and everything in context. But context had long since dissolved. The wall itself had been repainted multiple times. The physical trace no longer existed. Only the image remained, a ghost of a gesture. Sound analysis returned again, this time paired with behavioral modeling. If there had been words exchanged, what kind would they have been? Calm, measured, persuasive. Analysts imagined a voice that didn't rise, that didn't threaten overtly, that framed compliance as the reasonable option. The kind of voice people listen to even when they shouldn't. The idea was unsettling, because it suggested that the encounter might have felt ordinary, even forgettable, until it was too late. This reframing shifted attention away from the dramatic moment of death, and toward the quieter moments before it. The walk. The pause. The choice to stop instead of continue. These were the moments no one saw, no one recorded, but they were where the outcome was decided. The murder itself may have lasted seconds. The lead-up may have lasted minutes. Minutes were enough. The family, informed of the new interpretations, responded with a weary clarity. They didn't want speculation presented as progress. They had lived too long with maybes. What they wanted, if anything, was honesty about uncertainty. An acknowledgement that the case existed in a space beyond resolution, where the best anyone could do was describe the shape of what had happened, not its cause. Berlin's relationship with its own past is complicated, layered, often contradictory. The city preserves some histories obsessively while allowing others to fade quietly. The unsolved homicide fell into the latter category, not dramatic enough to demand memorialization, not distant enough to become myth. It lingered in a gray zone, acknowledged by institutions, but rarely by culture. Still, traces emerged in unexpected places. An urban studies seminar referenced the case while discussing non-places, spaces defined by transit rather than identity. An alley, a corridor, a threshold. Places people pass through without registering. The argument was simple and disturbing. Violence is easiest where attention is weakest. The Berlin case became a footnote in that discussion, but footnotes have a way of shaping conclusions. Those who had walked that alley for years began to see it differently after learning its history, even if only vaguely. They couldn't articulate the change, but they felt it. A slight acceleration of pace. A glance backward. Awareness sharpened by knowledge. The space itself hadn't changed. The meaning had. Former investigators sometimes wondered whether the killer had returned to the area in later years, drawn by the same anonymity that had once protected them. It was a common question in unsolved cases, fueled more by imagination than evidence. But the idea lingered. That someone might revisit a place not out of guilt, but out of familiarity. That the city might unknowingly host both the memory of the crime and the person who committed it, moving in parallel without collision. The notion raised uncomfortable possibilities about coexistence, about how cities absorb everything without discrimination. Victims and perpetrators share infrastructure, schedules, air. Justice, when it fails to intervene, does not create separation. It creates proximity. As time went on, the case shifted again, this time into the realm of philosophy rather than investigation. It became a question about limits. About what can be known and what must be accepted as unknowable. About whether meaning requires answers, or whether it can exist in their absence. These were not questions police departments are designed to answer, but they emerged nonetheless, carried by the unresolved weight of the story. The alley, now cleaner, brighter, more ordinary than ever, stood as a quiet contradiction. Nothing about it suggested violence. Nothing demanded remembrance. And yet, for those who knew, it remained charged, a place where the city's confidence in itself faltered briefly. A reminder that order is often retrospective, imposed after the fact, and that before it arrives, there is only uncertainty. The case file remained sealed, but not inert. It influenced how people thought about safety, about attention, about silence. It shaped training, informed caution, inspired research. Its impact spread without resolution, a ripple that never quite dissipated. Late one evening, long after most had stopped actively thinking about the case, a former detective stood at the entrance to the alley, unplanned, unannounced. He hadn't intended to be there. His route had simply taken him past it. He paused, listening. The city hummed around him, distant and indifferent. Nothing moved in the alley except a scrap of paper caught in a draft. He realized then that what haunted him wasn't the absence of answers, but the completeness of the disappearance. The way the crime had folded into the city without leaving a seam. It wasn't a rupture. It was a subtraction. Something removed so cleanly that the space closed over it almost immediately. That understanding didn't bring peace. But it brought clarity. The case wasn't waiting to be solved in the traditional sense. It was waiting to be understood for what it was. A demonstration of how little disturbance it takes to change everything, how easily a life can vanish when conditions align just right. As he turned away and continued on his path, the alley returned to its function, absorbing another set of footsteps, another moment. The city carried on, as it always did, building, forgetting, remembering selectively. And somewhere within that ongoing motion, the unresolved homicide remained, intact and unanswered, not demanding attention, but enduring it. A quiet constant in a place defined by change. Time did what it always does to unsolved cases. It softened the edges without dulling the weight. The sharp outrage faded first, then the urgency, then the expectation that answers would arrive if people just waited long enough. What remained was something heavier and harder to name, a quiet pressure that sat beneath the city's surface, unnoticed until someone brushed against it. The Berlin homicide no longer erupted in conversation, it seeped. In police archives, the file aged differently than the city outside. Paper yellowed. Ink faded. Terminology changed. Early reports used language that later generations would never approve, assumptions frozen in phrasing that now felt foreign. Each time the case was reopened, it wasn't just the evidence being re-examined, but the mindset of the era that had first shaped it. Investigators weren't only chasing a killer, they were wrestling with their predecessors. One detail that kept resurfacing was the absence of panic. No recorded scream. No frantic calls. No witnesses describing a struggle. That silence became more troubling than any noise ever could. Crimes often announce themselves through chaos. This one arrived like a whisper. Analysts began to suspect that whatever happened unfolded in a narrow emotional range, controlled, contained. Violence without spectacle. That realization shifted the imagined profile yet again. Not impulsive. Not erratic. Someone capable of suppressing escalation, of keeping the moment small. The kind of person who understood space and timing, who knew how to avoid drawing eyes. It suggested experience, but not necessarily criminal experience. Familiarity could come from anywhere: work, environment, routine. The victim's last known movements were replayed endlessly on paper. Steps traced on maps. Timelines compressed and expanded. At one point, a gap of less than 4 minutes became the focal point of an entire review. 4 minutes where nothing was confirmed, where assumptions rushed in to compensate for the void. 4 minutes in which an ordinary night crossed into permanence. In those minutes, investigators imagined countless micro-decisions. A glance. A hesitation. A choice not to cross the street. Each one harmless in isolation. Together, irreversible. The randomness of it was unbearable. People wanted a reason, a cause that could be avoided, a lesson that could be taught. The case refused to offer one. Journalists occasionally tried to resurrect the story, usually on anniversaries. Headlines hinted at breakthroughs that never quite materialized. Sources spoke of renewed interest, fresh eyes, modern techniques. The public learned to read between the lines. Interest did not mean progress. Fresh eyes often saw the same walls. When DNA analysis advanced, hope surged again. The evidence was reprocessed, rechecked, reclassified. Results came back partial, degraded, insufficient. Technology had moved forward. The past had not cooperated. It was another reminder that progress is not retroactive. Some moments are lost to their own time. The family adapted in ways outsiders rarely understood. They learned how to answer questions without reopening wounds, how to acknowledge the case without living inside it. They spoke of the victim in the present tense sometimes, not out of denial, but out of habit. Grief had altered their language. Closure, that overused word, never arrived. What they achieved instead was endurance. In the neighborhood, new residents moved in unaware. Apartments changed hands. Renovations erased traces of earlier decades. The alley became brighter, cleaner, safer by design. Urban planners succeeded in everything except memory. The crime scene became just another passageway, stripped of its story unless someone chose to tell it. Those who did know felt a strange responsibility. Not to solve the case, but to remember it accurately. To resist embellishment. To avoid turning it into legend. The truth, even incomplete, deserved protection. Mystery did not need exaggeration. It was powerful enough as it was. A criminologist once described the case as structurally invisible. Not because it lacked evidence, but because it lacked narrative hooks. No dramatic chase. No iconic suspect. No definitive twist. It defied the storytelling instincts that usually keep cases alive in the public imagination. That invisibility may have been its greatest shield. Behind the scenes, a small circle of professionals continued to revisit it, driven less by optimism than by obligation. Unsolved cases exert a gravitational pull on those who work them. They linger in thought, resurface unexpectedly, attach themselves to unrelated moments. A similar alley. A similar time of night. A similar silence. One investigator admitted that the case had changed how he walked through cities. He no longer trusted well-lit spaces implicitly. He paid attention to transitions, to thresholds, to places where responsibility blurred. He understood now that danger didn't announce itself with darkness or decay. Sometimes it hid inside normalcy. The file was never officially closed, only quieted. It existed in a state of suspended acknowledgement, available but untouched, like a book everyone meant to return to someday. Each year that passed made that return less likely, not because the desire faded, but because the distance grew harder to cross. And yet, unresolved cases have a way of persisting beyond logic. They surface in policy discussions, in training modules, in academic papers about failure and limitation. They become reference points, not for what was achieved, but for what wasn't. The Berlin homicide joined that category, an example used cautiously, respectfully. As night fell over the city again and again, the place where it happened continued to perform its function, indifferent to its history. Footsteps echoed briefly, then disappeared. Conversations passed through and dissolved. Life moved forward without permission from the past. But the case remained, not as a question waiting for an answer, but as a presence. A reminder that some truths do not emerge under pressure, that some stories resist completion. The silence surrounding the crime was no longer empty. It was full of everything that could not be said, could not be proven, could not be undone. And in that silence, the unresolved homicide endured, steady and unyielding, woven into the city's fabric, so tightly that removing it would require tearing something else apart. By the time 2 decades had passed, the case had crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer something that had recently gone wrong. It was something that had always been wrong. New investigators encountered it not as a failure of a particular night, but as a permanent flaw in the system, a reminder that not every story bends toward resolution. The Berlin homicide had outlived careers, procedures, even buildings. What remained was a file that felt heavier each time it was lifted, as if time itself had settled into its pages. There was a moment, years after the last serious push, when an anonymous tip arrived without ceremony. No dramatic phone call. No coded message. Just a brief note routed through standard channels, vague but unsettling. It referenced the location with unsettling accuracy, mentioned a detail that had never been made public, then stopped short of accusation. No names. No demands. Just enough specificity to reopen a door everyone thought had sealed itself shut. The tip triggered protocol, but not excitement. Experience had taught caution. Many such messages came from people seeking attention, or from memories distorted by time. Still, the detail couldn't be ignored. It matched something buried deep in the file, a minor observation dismissed early on because it lacked context. Now it had context, or at least the illusion of it. Investigators retraced steps they knew by heart. The alley. The surrounding blocks. Records of residents and businesses from that period were pulled again, thinner now, incomplete. People had moved, died, disappeared into other lives. Each missing piece widened the gap between what could be known and what once had been knowable. The author of the tip was never identified. Follow-up attempts led nowhere. Digital traces evaporated. It was as if the message had been designed to exist only briefly, long enough to disturb, not long enough to pursue. Some wondered if that was the point. To remind the system of its own vulnerability. To confirm that someone, somewhere, still remembered exactly what had happened. The possibility that the perpetrator was alive, watching, aging alongside the case, unsettled those who thought about it too long. Time does not punish evenly. While the victim remained frozen in the moment of death, everyone else continued forward, collecting years, memories, excuses. Justice delayed did not feel neutral. It felt like imbalance. Psychological profiles grew more abstract as physical leads dwindled. Theories focused on temperament rather than identity. Someone patient. Someone comfortable with ambiguity. Someone capable of carrying a secret without visible strain. Not haunted, not reckless. Ordinary enough to blend in completely. That ordinariness was the most disturbing element of all. The city itself seemed complicit in the forgetting. Construction projects erased old sightlines. New lighting altered shadows. Surveillance cameras multiplied, but too late. Every upgrade felt like an apology delivered to the wrong decade. If this had happened now, people said, it would be solved in days. The statement offered no comfort. It only sharpened the sense of loss. Occasionally, the case intersected with others, linked briefly by coincidence or pattern. A similar method. A comparable location. Each time, hope flickered, then died quietly when connections dissolved under scrutiny. The Berlin homicide remained stubbornly singular, refusing to belong to a series or trend. It stood alone, isolated by its own specifics. In academic circles, the case became a teaching tool, a study in negative space. Students were asked not what evidence existed, but what was missing and why. They learned to see absence as data, silence as signal. The lesson was uncomfortable but necessary. Some crimes do not collapse under analysis. They endure it. For the family, anniversaries passed without ceremony. No new statements. No renewed appeals. They had learned that expectation was its own form of suffering. Instead, they marked time privately, holding on to memories untouched by speculation or theory. The victim was not a case to them. Not a lesson. Just a person whose life had been interrupted without explanation. The alley remained open, unremarkable. People passed through it every day without noticing the slight narrowing at the center, the way sound softened there, the way footsteps seemed to hesitate before continuing. Those sensations meant nothing unless you knew. And most people didn't. One former investigator admitted, years later, that the case had altered his understanding of justice. He no longer believed it was inevitable. He saw it now as conditional, dependent on timing, resources, luck. The Berlin homicide had slipped through a gap where all three failed simultaneously. That realization carried a quiet dread. If this case could vanish so completely, others could too. They probably already had. The system recorded outcomes, not near misses, not questions that never found their voice. Unsolved crimes were not anomalies. They were part of the landscape. As night settled over Berlin once more, the city glowed with movement and sound, alive and unconcerned. Somewhere within it, the truth of what happened that night still existed, intact and inaccessible, carried by memory or buried beneath it. The case did not ask to be solved anymore. It simply remained, a fixed point in a city that never stopped changing, proof that some stories do not end, they persist, unresolved, waiting not for answers, but for acknowledgement. As the years continued to layer themselves over the crime, the case entered a strange afterlife. It no longer lived in active investigation, nor did it rest fully in history. It occupied a middle ground, resurfacing unpredictably, not because of new evidence, but because of new eyes. Every generation that encountered it brought different questions, shaped by different fears. What once seemed like an anomaly now felt like a warning. Internal reviews began framing the homicide less as a failure to identify a suspect, and more as a study in how systems lose momentum. Early decisions, made under pressure, had narrowed possibilities too quickly. Paths not taken became permanent absences. The file told two stories at once, the story of a death, and the story of how attention drifts when certainty doesn't arrive on schedule. One subtle, but persistent issue was jurisdictional hesitation. The location of the crime sat at the edge of multiple administrative boundaries, each responsible for fragments, but not the whole. In the early days, this had seemed manageable. Over time, it became corrosive. Information moved slowly. Ownership blurred. Responsibility thinned. No single entity failed outright, but no one fully succeeded either. The crime itself resisted emotional framing. There was no cruelty displayed, no message left behind. It was efficient, contained, almost clinical in its restraint. That absence of excess complicated public empathy. People struggled to grasp violence that didn't look violent. Without spectacle, outrage softened. Attention shifted elsewhere. Privately, some investigators wondered whether the lack of visible brutality was intentional. Not as an act of mercy, but as a strategy. The quieter the crime, the faster it blended into the city's background noise. The fewer ripples it caused, the less likely it was to draw sustained scrutiny. It was an unsettling thought, one that reframed restraint as calculation. A renewed review of witness statements revealed how fragile memory had been even in the immediate aftermath. Descriptions conflicted subtly, not enough to invalidate each other, but enough to prevent alignment.